Thank you, Ken. As we transition here, I can see that we've been sitting for a while, so why don't you all stand up for a second? And Ken used the word consequate. So I feel a personal responsibility to you. So first of all, raise your left hand really high if you can. And then raise your right hand. Stretch it. Okay, now drop your left hand. Okay, so repeat after me. I do pledge that if I go out tonight in New Orleans, come on, if I go out tonight in New Orleans, I will be very, very careful. If I consequate. All right, sit down. So I want to thank Ken for inviting me here and for that introduction, and also NextLearn for bringing us all together. I sat yesterday as a learner in the SimWriter training to hone my skills, and I could tell by the questions that were being asked that there's a lot of smart people here. And I learned a heck of a lot from the speakers there, from Cassie, Karen, and Eric. But I also learned something really important to me, a question I've had for like 6 months from the person sitting next to me, Rona. Thank you very much. So there's a lot of opportunities here from us to learn from each other, not just from the speakers. So I really appreciate this opportunity that NextLearn has brought to us. Now, I'm completely and utterly delighted to be here today because I get to talk about two of the passions from my life: simulations and research. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where I come from on this research stuff, so you'll have an idea of my perspectives on this. You'll understand what type of research I'm talking about, and you'll know sort of my sweet spots and my blind spots. Now, every year I read over 200 articles from scientific referee journals on learning, memory, and instruction. And what I do is I look at those articles and I translate them from the research into practical recommendations. So I'm trying to cut through the jargon, ignore the theoretical baggage that goes with them, trying to look at what causes what. Now, it turns out, and I didn't realize this at first, but it turns out that in our industry, research doesn't pay, or it doesn't pay very much. So I've had the opportunity to do other things as well. So I do things like work learning audits. So I'll go in a company and I'll be able to do job shadowing, look at how people are learning on the job, look at how they're performing on the job, and seeing the links between the learning and performance. Also do research benchmarking, so I go out and look at a training program, whether it's a classroom training program, or e-learning, or social media, and compare it to what the research best practices suggest. I do consulting, I do workshops on all types of instructional design things, learning measurement, how to write scenario-based questions, etc. So I've been doing this for like 14 years, and I've learned over that time that research is not enough, and practice is not enough, even thoughtful practice. Only by combining the two can we create the most effective learning interventions, and only by combining the two can we really move the field forward. So one of the things I'm going to do today is to share that intersection between the two. So now from research we go to simulations. And there's lots of simulations out there. But if you're looking at a simulation, how do you know you've got a good one? How do you know you've got an effective one? If you're building a simulation, how do you know that you're designing it in such a way to have maximum effectiveness? Okay. There's lots of questions around
Will,
simulation design.
Is there a typo? Should there be no space between in and action next to Congress?
It's a political discussion. It's best had at 5 o'clock. So one of the reasons there's lots of questions around simulation and really learning design in general is because human learning is so complex, infinitely more complex than rocket science, right? And one of the reasons for that is that the human animal is so complex and so variable. Now, in my life in simulations, I've had lots of questions myself. The first simulation that I ever worked on, this was a brilliant idea that I had as an MBA student. I had to do an MBA project, and I decided that what I would do was to create a management simulation using the program language Lisp. Anybody know Lisp? Okay. And anybody love Lisp? Okay. So no hands are up. Lisp is this incredibly difficult language. It has this thing in there that's called recursion, and recursion is sort of like this looping thing, and well, the truth is I really can't explain it, and I never really figured it out then, and it was a complete failure, and I had to do something else. But the question there was, the question that I should have asked was, do I have the right tool for creating a simulation? And even if I had the right tool, how do I use this tool to create a powerful simulation? Later, when we were building the Complete Manager simulation, this was back in 1986, it was the first commercially viable software simulation, leadership simulation, at least that we knew of, and we had no models to go by. We were creating this thing out of blue sky. And so one of the questions we asked ourselves was, can we use multiple choice questions to create a simulation? And we decided, yes, we could. But then the question becomes, how do we do this effectively? How do we write these questions effectively? How do we provide feedback on them effectively? How do we create a complete learning package that's going to be effective? Later, I moved to New York and got involved on as project manager on the Classroom Inc. project. We're developing at-risk or simulations for at-risk high school students in Brooklyn, New York. And we had a booklet of learning objectives, like 200 or 300 learning objectives. So the questions there were, well, how do we decide what to simulate? Of all these things, how do we prioritize them? In my work in the last 14 years, balancing the research and practice stuff, the big questions are, well, what does the research say about simulations? Where do you go? What do you do when looking at scenarios and simulations and all that kind of context-based stuff? How do we design those to be most effective? So there's always these questions around simulations. And fortunately, today, I have the answers for you. But I'm not going to give you a list of recommendations. I'm not going to give you a recipe or a series of recipes. Now, if you teach someone to cook by having them go through a series of recipes, do they become a good cook? They can follow the recipe. Well, what they don't have, their knowledge, their learning is fragile. What I mean by that is, if anything goes wrong, they're in deep doo-doo, right? If someone comes along and says, hey, I have a food allergy, they don't know what to substitute. If they don't have the ingredients, if they don't have a particular ingredient, how do you substitute? If the altitude is a little bit different, if the apples are the wet kind of apples versus the dry kind of apples, if something goes wrong, if the batter doesn't seem to be rising, how do you troubleshoot that? Their knowledge is fragile because they don't have deep mental models about how cooking works. So instead of giving you a list of recipes, what I'm going to do is try to share with you some fundamental research on human learning as it applies to simulations. Now, when I do this, some of this stuff will resonate immediately with you. You will nod your head, you'll go, aha, I get that. Will, thank you for providing that metaphor. Thank you for the reminder. Thank you for helping me think a little bit about that a little bit differently. But some of this stuff, and I want to give you this warning, is a little bit provocative. it may challenge your long-held views about how learning works. What I won't do is share with you a whole bunch of research that says a simulation is better than some other learning method. I think actually Ken laid out a really good case for the benefits of simulation. By the way, we used to call him Kenny back in Street. I'm not going to do that, and here's the key. Anybody tweeting this conference? This is the one thing to tweet. Simulations do not create learning. It's what simulations do that creates the learning. So that's what we're going to focus on. You ready to go? So, we'll start out with the big picture. This is the learning landscape model. I'm going to share with you a little bit of it. If you want to see more, you can go to YouTube. It's my only viral video. We've got a training intervention, on-the-job performance situation, and learning outcomes. We create training here so that people perform better in their on-the-job performance situations and we get better outcomes. This is the causal pathway. Our learners build understanding here. Later on the job, they remember what they learned. They apply what they've learned to their jobs. The learners get a return on their efforts. They're putting some efforts in. And the organization gets a return on its investment. Now this orange pathway here is the typical pathway in the training and development field. This is what we focus on. This is where simulations have an impact. But we ought to realize that it's not the only thing that's out there. There's also prompting mechanisms, things like job aids, performance support, intuitive cues in our equipment, in our tools, signage, management, etc. And also there's on-the-job learning as well. People learn on the job through trial and practice, getting help from others, social media. This is where a lot of the social media stuff comes in, studying on their own, etc. And so, when we think about simulations, we ought to realize that it's part of a bigger package. And it may not be the only thing. Simulations are powerful. But if we really want on-the-job performance, we may have to go even beyond that. Another part of the big picture perspective, and Ken went over the learning curves a little bit. I'm going to emphasize these. On this graph, there's more remembering here, less remembering here. We've got during training and after training. So, and this, by the way, is one of my finest moments in PowerPoint. So we hope that our learners go up the learning curve during training. But the reality is, if they don't use the information very much, they're going to go down a forgetting curve. Hopefully they go down one that's less steep than one that's really steep. But ideally, we'd like to prepare them for further learning on the job. And we'd also like to do things after training that support that as well. One of the things to remember, though, is this often happens. The learners go down the learning curve, and we can ask ourselves, can we do anything to minimize that forgetting curve? And the answer, fortunately, is yes, we can. There's 3 things that we can do during training that minimize this forgetting curve. And this will be remembering approach number 1, 2, and 3. And we'll talk about these as we go through here, trying to build the suspense. Okay. We'd like to prevent this kind of thing, that people take the binder and put it back on the shelf, either literally or figuratively in their brain. We want to avoid that. So now we're going to jump right in. That's the introduction. Now I'm going to ask you to answer some questions. I'd like you to form into groups of 3 or 4 people. If you have less than 3, you might not have as many perspectives, and that's not good from a learning standpoint. If you have more than 4, all right, guys, you may not let everybody get a chance to talk. So form into groups of 3 or 4 folks. And here's your question. Imagine your radar damage assessment students have to take a paper and pencil certifying exam in 1 week. The exam will be held in the pilot's cabin in the officers' club. And the pilot's cabin is a small conference room in the officers' club. And if you want to maximize your students' scores, where should you hold your 1-week course? Okay, and here's your choices. In the pilot's cabin itself, in any distraction-free room, we're in a room with radar equipment and computers that can show radar photos and video. Okay, so I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to discuss that with your groups, and then we'll take a vote.
I would say C.
Yeah,
you think. Think about the orientation.
Getting the experience.
It's better, what I find is it's better if when you're in your groups that you fight a little bit amongst yourselves. It makes it more fun for me, actually. So, how many people say that the best answer is A, in the pilot's cabin? Okay. We have a lot of people right down the middle of the room. Okay, in any distraction-free room? Okay. And in a room with radar equipment and computers, etc. All right, so we have a lot of variety here. I like that. That's controversy. So, the answer, according to the research, is in A. Oh, come on, don't pat yourself on the back. Now, if you wanted to create the best radar damage assessment professionals, what would you do? C. Yeah. That's sort of like simulation, right?
Right.
I knew I'd get you on this one. Let's see why the pilot's cabin is suggested by the research. And what I'm going to do is go through some cognitive psychology stuff here, so hold on to your hats. How learners encode learning stimuli. Okay? Right now, you are learners, I hope, and you are absorbing information. But you're not just taking in the learning message. I have a few learning messages I'd like to impart, but you're also taking in the background context. So the background of this room, the clothes that I'm wearing, the tone of my voice, also the level of caffeine in your body, that's context. how you're feeling, the temperature in the room, everything. You're taking that all in as you learn here. So we've got the background context and the learning message. Okay, I'm going to simplify this, give you a real simple learning message here. A fosse is a ditch. A fosse is a synonym for the word ditch. I'm going to use that as our prototypical learning message, even though it's much simpler than the kind of things we usually do. So we encode this information by presenting it, and then later, as we're encoding it, it goes into long-term memory. This, by the way, this gray matter is your long-term memory. With the spikes there, it looks like your long-term memory on caffeine. But there you go, it goes into long-term memory, and there it sits until something happens. So let me use the fosse ditch example here. So this morning, I am reading the USA Today maybe, and I see the word fosse, and that's a cue for me. And because they use the word fosse in the context of castles, and I learned about fosses in the context of castles, it triggers that castle idea, because the castle idea is connected for me to the fosse idea, and I'm able to trigger this information. I retrieve it from memory, and it comes out of memory. Now let's think about this in terms of our question. We send our learners back into, they've learned the information in the pilot's cabin. That's the background context. They go back into the pilot's cabin, and because this information is attached to the information they learned there in the pilot's cabin, they're able to get the learning messages and then retrieve that from memory. Now, I've taught this for years, and I know that you're thinking to yourself, WTF? Will, how do you know this? How do we know that it works this way? Well, there's been a lot of research on this. Let me share some with you. They've had people learn in room A or in room B. If you learn in room A, you're better able to retrieve that information from room A than from room B, and vice versa. They've done this with scuba divers. They've had people learn on land or 30 feet underwater. If you learn 30 feet underwater, you're better able to retrieve that information 30 feet underwater than on land, and vice versa. But it's not just about visual context. There's other contexts. These are all actual experiments. If you learn smelling osmanthus, you're better able to retrieve the information you learned than in smelling osmanthus than smelling peppermint, and vice versa. If you learn listening to Mozart, you're better able to retrieve the information listening to Mozart than listening to jazz, and vice versa. All actual experiments. If you learn when it's quiet, you're better able to retrieve the information when it's quiet than when it's noisy, and vice versa. If you learn when you're happy, you're better able to retrieve the information when you're happy than when you're sad, and vice versa. Lots of experimentation on here. I'll give you one more example, and I want you to know that even though we're in the Big Easy, Dr. Will Thalheimer does not recommend this. It's an actual experiment. If you learn under the influence of marijuana, you're better able to retrieve the information under the influence than if you're straight, and vice versa. Anybody want to experiment? Now, some of you might say, well, I don't trust research. Well, how about this? And this happens less these days because our cell phones are all plugged in with everybody's phone numbers, but have you ever tried to remember somebody's phone number, but you can't do it unless you look at the keypad? Or you go to the ATM. I've had this happen lots in my life, and I just can't remember my ATM PIN until I actually see the keypad, and then I can remember. It's the context that's reminding us. What about this? You're in your kitchen, and you decide, oh, I have to go get something from the living room. So you walk over to the living room, and you get there, and you can't remember what you wanted. So what do you do first? No, you don't go back first. What do you do first? You look around for clues. Right? If you don't see any, then you go back to the kitchen. Why do you go back there? That is where you encoded the intention of going to get something. This phenomenon is one of the most fundamental phenomenons in human cognition, this context alignment notion. Now here's some of these experiments. This is the first one that got it started. If you learn and retrieve in a different context, these are different rooms, you don't do as well as if you're in the same context. Look at that improvement. Now, since this is the first research I've shown you, I'm going to explain this in a little bit more depth. On this axis is the amount of remembering. Okay, so this could be the number of questions, it could be the percentage remembered, etc. Some performance thing there. Since I read so many articles, I don't know exactly what that was. A couple things. The date, this is from 1978. I gave you this one because this is the first classic experiment. The date of the research doesn't matter that much. It's really the methodology, the rigor of the experiment. The human learning system, it hasn't really changed that much in the last 10,000 years. So it's really not about the date of the experiments. Oftentimes I might show one piece of research, but there's usually dozens or hundreds of other studies behind that, as I'll illustrate in a moment. This is the odor experiment. Different odors at encoding and retrieval versus the same odors. Noise, this is quiet and noisy. Okay, so you can see if you have in the same context, there's a lot of benefits. And just to show you that there's lots of research behind this, I grabbed the citation list from one of my earlier papers on this, and there you go. It keeps going and going. Okay. How do we utilize this? Well, first of all, it might be helpful to think about this in terms of spontaneous remembering. So if you are in the pilot's cabin, you go back in there after you've learned it, the cues in that environment trigger you to spontaneously remember what you've learned. Now there's 4 ways that we can do this. Okay, we can change the learning context to make it more similar to the performance context. What does that sound like? Simulation. We could also, theoretically, change the performance context, right? Not sure why we'd want to do that or if we have the power to do that, but we could do that. We can also provide multiple learning contexts. That's simulation as well, if we design them well. And finally, we can add transportable cues to the learning context and the performance context. So what that means is if you knew that your learners were going to be listening to Mozart's Third Symphony during their work, you could take that cue and bring it to the learning situation. So it's like the learners are transporting the cue from learning, from encoding, to retrieval. What transportable cue am I using right now to help remind me, to help trigger me, to create this spontaneous remembering in me so I remember what I want to tell you? Right? When I see one of these, it reminds me to tell a story. Right? And actually, I practice, sometimes I practice with this in my hotel room, and I do this in a lot of different contexts. All these things. That's why in the theater, they do dress rehearsals. Because you want the other person's costume to help remind you of what lines to say. Okay, so these are the 4 things that we can do. Questions on this notion of context alignment. And by the way, feel free to ask questions. I know some of these concepts are kind of, there's a lot to them, and you may be processing this, and so if you have a question, probably other people have questions.
I have a question,
Yes.
because I have a 17-year-old daughter who likes to listen to music while she's studying for physics.
I get this
or whatever.
question almost every time I talk about it.
Yeah. So what I told her was, oh well, you're supposed to turn it all up because it just doesn't work for her. I mean, what I heard was, she needs to be in a quiet room. She needs to commit it to memory. She has to focus on only that. That doesn't work for her. She loves that. She'll even put earbuds in, and I don't know how she does that. So what's right and what's wrong?
Well, just remember, you're going to get learning no matter what you do. There is a benefit, an extra added benefit to this context. Now, if that's the only way that she can actually attend to the information, you always have to break it down into its component parts. So that's the only way that she can attend to the information in the first place, well then that might be a benefit. But she's probably not getting this context effect. Okay. So you might You know, I'm not gonna tell you to encourage a teenage daughter to do anything, okay? That's,
I'll tell her you said.
yeah, okay. Okay, we'll talk. All right. Yes.
Well, you skipped over number 2 almost dismissively, and I suspect that's a mistake. It seems to me that number 2 has a lot to do with organization design. It has to do a lot with space and location. And very often training, if you want to avoid that forgetting curve, I think organizations might want to pay attention to the performance context. There are times when the performance context is doing very, very, very little to help people perform, and it can be improved.
Well, I agree with you, and there's 2 aspects to that. One is the performance context is really important in a lot of other ways. The context way, you know, let's say we design a simulation the way we think the world should work. Are we really going to be able to have the leverage to get a manager on the job to change the way he runs a meeting to have that trigger that? That's a little harder from our standpoint because we have less influence there. But you're absolutely right, and that's why it's there. Thanks, Paul.
We
good to
have,
see you, by the way. It's been years.
we have students who use our service for test prep, go through test prep courses. If we simulated so we don't have any control over the context that they take the test in, they're administered elsewhere. So if we simulated the UI, for instance, that they would be under, timing, kind of what it looked like.
Pressure.
Do you feel like that would simulate
Yes.
what they'd be experiencing?
Yeah. You want to simulate as much as possible. You know, you look at some of the high-risk things like pilot training, they try to simulate it all, you know, including some of the psychological context as well. Right? You have bullets really flying over your head and stuff like that. Yeah.
I want to clarify about the 17-year-old and the music. So if the test is given with no noise in a quiet, is it safe to say that it's a different context? So just knowing that they're going to be taking the test in a very quiet, subdued environment, learning it with a lot of noise and distraction isn't providing a similar context.
That's right. It's not the similar context. But again, if sometimes everybody, teenagers included, are stressed out about studying, and if that's the only thing that's going to get them to calm down a little bit, to focus, then that's good. Yeah.
So while I can understand the connection between those things, and even the idea of taking this scenario of a teenage girl listening to music, I guess I'm wondering how far out of context you can go before it matters. Which is to say, she's already out of context. She's sitting in her bedroom. There's nothing probably about her bedroom that is anything like the classroom that she sits in when she takes the test. So she's already removed herself in a fairly large degree from the context for performance. So does the additional thing, is there a tipping point? Does it matter? How much does it matter?
Well, you know, there's no hard and fast rule there. Sorry, I'm gonna. And one of the things to keep in mind is the most important part of the context is the content that you study. Okay, the background context, as we've seen in these experiments, matters too, but the content context is even more important. Okay, so she's going to get that whether she's in her bedroom or not. Now there are some effects they've shown that if you imagine what the performance context is going to be like, you've heard about athletes trying to imagine, right? So there can be some benefits to that. But yeah, this is, like I started in the beginning, this is very complicated. So you want to create as much fidelity as possible, but you want to be sensible about the logistics and all the other aspects of it too.
So it shows a difference. It doesn't show that you completely don't get it.
Right.
I mean,
We're going to have at the 5 o'clock thing, we're going to have a separate group. We'll meet over there in the corner about how to get your teenager to study. All right, so your next question is, Johnny and her team have been working on a new training program. The course is going to be run for 4 hours over 3 mornings from 8 to 12 noon. Okay, Johnny compiles enough content to have 30 specific learning points. So that's 3 days, 10 learning points per day. She decides to use the last 30 minutes of each class to ask well-designed questions on the key content areas. So in your groups, decide whether you think that design for the last 30 minutes of the class is okay. And you can just simply say yes or no. And then suppose somebody asks for your advice, what would you advise? What would you do with the last 30 minutes? So why don't you jump into that and talk about that for a few minutes.
Sounds to me it's so 2.5 hours.
Okay. Hold on, I have new information. I have new information for you. So, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question to puzzle through as well. So, which of the following would create the best long-term memory? Use the last 30 minutes to review the key content areas. Use the last 30 minutes to provide questions on the key content areas, but you don't give any feedback to the learners. Or use the last, in other words, they just answer the questions. Use the last 30 minutes to provide questions on the key content areas and provide feedback. But don't just pick the best one. I want you to rank order these. First, second, third. Okay.
I think that's kind of the old that's how that's the old way. I think how do
that this design for the last 30 minutes of the class was okay? Raise your hands. Okay, how many thought it was not okay? All right, so what would you guys do instead? Don't just say simulate, all right?
Chunk it, break it up, space it.
Break it up, space it a little bit. Okay, good. What else? Yes.
I think you need more than 30 minutes to review 4 hours of content.
Okay, more than 30 minutes. Great. What else? Okay, let's get to the fun part. Okay. Now, one thing you don't know about me is that I'm telepathic. And that I know that most of you thought that C was the best answer here. Raise your hand if I'm right. Still got it. Okay. So what's most interesting, though, from a learning standpoint, is the difference between these two. So I want you to raise your hand if you think that A is better than B. Okay. And I want you to raise your hand if you think B is better than A. Controversy, I love it. Okay. Now, I'll bet you that those of you who chose this one were worried that there was no feedback here. Am I right? Telepathy is what you think. Okay. So, the answer, according to the research, is that B is going to be better than A. Oh. Hey, this is not going to your performance portfolio, okay? All right, so here, this is why. When our learners encode information, we talked about this earlier, it goes into long-term memory. People may rehearse it, say it to themselves. Oh, Foss is a ditch. They may say it out loud. That's encoding in a nutshell. Here's retrieval. We've got our cue. We search. We might rehearse it, say it to ourselves. Oh, that's right, a Foss is a ditch. Foss is a ditch. So what's the difference between encoding and retrieval? It's a rhetorical question because it's pretty obvious. It's right there. The cue and the search is different. What do we want our learners to be able to do on the job? We want them to be able to retrieve what they learned from us. If this is what we want them to do on the job, shouldn't we provide them with practice in doing that during learning? Yes. This is presentation. This is having them do something. So let's analyze our question. Okay, this was answer A. We review the key concept areas. So the first 3 hours of the course, we present them with stuff. The last 30 minutes of the course, we present them with stuff. You see any retrieval there?
No.
So this is B. This is when we ask them questions. We don't provide any answers, but we answer some questions. So what's the difference between A and B? It's obvious, the cue and the search, retrieval. And here is C, presentation, provide them with questions, a retrieval practice, and then provide them with feedback when they need it. So this is why this one's better. And the retrieval process is why B is better than A. Now you might say, well, Will, wait a minute, what if they're answering a lot of questions incorrectly? That could be. So if the content was really difficult, and we couldn't really get them to understand the concepts in that first 3.5 hours, then retrieval practice might not have been the way to go. But I was assuming that you could get them to get it up there.
But how do
so
you
you
know
give yourself partial credit if...
How do you know if they're getting it in that first 3.5 hours if there's not some mechanism for practice to be done?
Well, you don't. You don't. So let me show you some research on this. So this is a classic series of experiments done a long time ago. This guy had them in a college classroom, gave them 60 minutes of lecture, or 55 minutes of lecture, and then 5 minutes answering questions. No feedback. So just by using that last 5 minutes to have them retrieve information from memory shows you the power of retrieval practice. Here's another one. You have them learn and then learn some more. That's what we have. Presentation, presentation, and then retrieval. Retrieval is a powerful concept. And here's the actual question I asked you, or a correlate of it. No tests, right? Versus a test with no feedback versus a test with feedback. Tests, prompts, retrieval practice.
So what does no no feedback really mean though? Because they're asking a question, you're answering it. To me, that's feedback. So what does that really mean, no feedback?
So if I ask you a question, you answer it, I say nothing, right? You may not know whether you're right or wrong. So you're not getting feedback. Right? Now sometimes you'll know, like if you have no idea, then you'll know, that's feedback. But a lot of times the case is people don't know the answer. Okay, so this is the research, and I'm going to do this again. There's a lot of other studies behind this. Okay. So let's...
I like to say something. I don't know if there's any college educators in here, but I took a philosophy class online. Very difficult. So you are given the assignment, and you're asked the questions, you respond, and then a week later, once you've moved on to the next topic, is when you get your feedback. So where's the teaching? You're just doing self. I mean, I don't feel that I learned anything unless I learn a week later and try to remember, okay, what did I write about now in Nietzsche, and that was Plato. You know, it's just.
Nietzsche's hard.
Yeah. So if there's any online college, consider that. I mean, that's just not.
Okay, we're going to actually talk about this very question about when to deliver feedback in a few minutes. That's an excellent segue. Yes?
The other thing I was kind of wondering about, the B with no feedback.
Yeah.
So you ask me a question, I give an answer. So now I don't know if I give the wrong answer. I might assume it's correct, and I've made a bad practice.
Good. Hold on to that thought. We're going to talk more depth about feedback because it's really a complicated area, and it may not be what you think it is. But feedback's really important. And what this shows us is that even without feedback, this retrieval practice idea is so powerful that we ought to think about can we input that into our learning more often. Now, obviously, choice C was better because we did give them feedback, right? So I'm not saying not to use feedback, but I'm showing this research to show the power of feedback. Paul.
There's testing to reinforce learning, and there's testing to validate learning. And one of the problems with schools is very often testing is being used to give grades. And if the teacher is so focused on giving grades that they're not worrying about whether the test reinforces learning, you can lose things. Some teachers are very concerned if there's cheating on the test. Is it okay for students to collaborate or to share with each other? If all you're worried about is retention and learning, you don't care if there's sharing, because the question and being confronted with the question that reinforces the learning. And so I think when this can happen in corporate training too, if we're so worried about the test being the certification that we forget that it's part of the learning, we can design learning.
Absolutely. And there's this thing called the testing effect, which is all about providing people with retrieval practice. Testing can be a benefit to learning. There's other ways to get retrieval practice too. Simulations is one. By the way, Paul taught me how to eat Ethiopian food once, and you should grab him later today. I'll tell you all about it. All right, now a lot of people have a little difficulty with this, and they like this metaphor, and I'll share it with you. So let's imagine that your mind is filled with 1 billion trees. And if you want to search through memory, you start here, you tramp down on the undergrowth, and you go back there, and you come out of this, and then you retrieve the information. So that if you give your learners retrieval practice, you're sort of creating a pathway through memory. And then if you give them multiple retrieval practice opportunities, you create a little further path. And then, ideally what we'd like to create is like a super highway through memory so that our learners never forget, right? And then we have something that looks like that. So if we look at these different diagrams, I really like this metaphor for a couple of reasons. It shows the power of retrieval practice. But imagine this path here. What would happen in the forest if nobody walked down that pathway? It would grow over. And what's the analog to that in memory? Forgetting, right? So, ideally, you can see this would be much more difficult to overgrow than all the others. This would be easier. This would be harder. Okay, so I have to tell you what my wife. She once saw. She wanted to know what do you guys do in this learning profession, right? So she came to a local ISPI meeting, and I was giving a presentation. I talked about the retrieval practice in the forest and things. And I'm going, well, you walk back through and you stamp down all the weeds, and then you come back out. And I asked her later, well, how do you think it went? And she's an environmental advocate. And she said, well, I thought it was good, but those aren't weeds. Those are a vital part of the ecosystem. Another time I was presenting this, and this is not my joke, okay, but some guy said, well, so, you go back to the forest of your mind, and if you can't remember, then you would say that you were stumped. Okay. So there's lots of ways to do retrieval practice. You can give people questions, problems to solve, case studies, simulations. You can have people discuss things. You teach them it, have a discussion. You have to retrieve it from memory. There's lots of ways to do retrieval practice. Here's some interesting real-world simulation. But this is back in the Vietnam War. And our pilots were fighting their pilots, and we would shoot down 2 for every one of theirs. We would have one of ours shot down for every 2 we shot down to theirs. And this is for the Navy pilots. And there was a ceasefire here, and you can see they got a lot better. Why was that? Top Gun, right. The Navy implemented the Top Gun program, which was basically simulating the real world of flying. And you say, well, how do you know it was that? Maybe they got better technology or something. Well, this is what the Air Force did. All right, they didn't have that simulation program. So you can see in real life, the 2 things that we've talked about are the essence of simulation: aligning the learning performance context and providing retrieval practice. Okay, and one of the key things about retrieval practice is figuring out what those realistic cues are in people's performance situation. We'll talk about that later. So, you want to improve learning, minimize forgetting, and create spontaneous remembering. People like a formula, there it is for you. I'm going to introduce a complicating factor in all this, so bear with me a minute. Remember our graph, the learning landscape? We have learning and then remembering. Oftentimes, when we do learning, what we first want to do is to have people understand. We want them to have the right conceptual framework. We want them to understand the concepts, and then we want to provide them with retrieval practice. So this is something we do early in learning. We focus on understanding, and when the content seems complex. And later in learning, we want to provide retrieval practice when complexity is understood. Now, why is this relevant? Well, you can see our learning curve there. We're creating awareness, building understanding. Later, we're supporting retrieval and developing fluency. You can combine these to think about this conceptually as understanding and retrieval. And some people like fancy-looking graphs. We've got one. So simple concepts, you get quickly moving to fluency. Complex concepts, it takes a lot longer later in learning. So, and this is to get you thinking for the rest of the session. We talked about when simulations support retrieval, context alignment, retrieval practice. But when do simulations hurt retrieval? There are some times that they can do that. When do simulations support understanding? When do they detract from understanding? We'll come full circle to this later in the thing, but I want you to think about this as we go forward. Next question for you. Now this is a feedback form. It looks good graphically, but it's pretty bad feedback. But in general, if you had good feedback, when's the best time to give it? Immediately after each question, at the end of the test, after a delay of 2 hours or more, or after a delay of a day or more? Let's raise our hands. Immediately after each question. Okay. At the end of the test. After a delay of 2 hours or more. Or after a delay of a day or more. Okay. I love this. This is great. Another more controversy. This is a question about delayed feedback. I'm going to delay your feedback. See how that works. In general, feedback is a powerful thing, right? No feedback, feedback. That's the typical finding. Another question for you. What's more important? Giving feedback on correct or incorrect answers. Are they equally important? Are correct answers more important? Or incorrect answers more important? I'm going to start with the bottom one first. How many say C? Okay, how many say B? Not one? Oh, okay, good. At least we have one behaviorist in the room. And A, equally important. Okay? The right answer is C. And here's the research on why. The research is a little complicated. So first we give them learning materials, they learn. Then we test them, test one. And then we give them feedback, either no feedback or feedback. And then later we test them. And the results that I'm going to share with you are the results of this final test. Okay? So they either they're correct on test one here, or they're incorrect. And these are the results from this test. So you can see that if they're wrong on test one, feedback really helps. If they're correct on test one, feedback doesn't help. Here's another study. Same thing. Feedback really helps if they're wrong on test one. Feedback doesn't help that much if they're correct on test one. What feedback does is it corrects misconceptions. Whoop. So, so I was going to ask you, is feedback enough? And the answer is no. This is a nice study. You give people feedback, then you give them feedback and another chance to retrieve that information from memory. Not necessarily the same question, because the same question can be what? Boring, or you memorize based on the context. Think about the forest of your mind. What has someone not done if they've got something incorrect and you gave them feedback? What have they never done?
Gotten the right answer.
Say that again?
They've never gotten the right answer.
Never gotten the right answer. Give me that in the metaphor of the forest.
Oh.
Never walk that path.
They never walked down the correct path in memory. They've never gone from the cue to the information. So even if they get something wrong and you give them feedback, they've never actually gone down the right path through memory. And we know that by giving them that retrieval practice, that creates long-term memory benefits. It's one of the mistakes I used to make in designing simulations is I would never give them a second chance. Right? Okay. So here's the feedback summary. Feedback provides significant benefits. It's more important for correcting things. Supports retrieval practice, and we should probably provide retrieval practice after feedback if it's important. And we still haven't answered this question about whether immediate or delayed is good. Questions on feedback?
So does it hurt to give feedback on correct answers, or just doesn't help?
Doesn't help. It actually can hurt, I should say. If your learners feel they should know it, and I'll take that back. If your learners feel that your feedback on correct answers is boring or too much, they might tune out all your feedback. So it doesn't hurt for that answer, but it could hurt in general. They might go, oh, more feedback. So you got to be careful about that. We're going to come back. Yes, Paul.
On that point, in a classroom or in a training situation, not everybody gets the same thing wrong.
That's right.
So there will be instances in which maybe the majority of the class got it right. The feedback is still going to be important for the people who didn't. Be careful not to leave people behind.
Absolutely. And there's another complication, what I'll get to later, because people can get answers correct for the wrong reasons. Okay, on to the next topic. Repetitions. So you give them one, you present it once, you present it twice, you present it 3 times. Repetitions work. We know that. We can put that under our learning curve. There's a marginal utility for improvements, but repetitions tend to work. This is a real, this is learning research. This is real world research. This is the percentage of deaths with cancer surgery. This is the number of deaths. Higher is more deaths. Deaths are not good. You can see in a low volume hospital, in a low repetition hospital, people don't do as well. High volume, lots of repetitions are good. So this tells us that repetitions are good in the real world. Also tells you if you're ever going to have surgery, you should look for a doctor who's done this thing over and over and over, and actually an operating team that's worked together and done it over and over and over. My Outlook is syncing, trying to sync with Google. This drives me nuts. Okay. My wife had some back issues a few years ago, and she had to get like cortisone injections in her spine. And she went to our local hospital. The procedure took like an hour and a half, and it didn't work. And she went to the New England Baptist Back Clinic. They do these all the time, high repetition hospital. 10 minutes, and it worked. So, repetitions are valuable. Why do they work? Well, they help us absorb information we missed, help us remember things we've forgotten, and they strengthen and enrich what we already know. A lot of people think repetitions are about rote memorization. And there is that, there's verbatim repetition, but there's also many other types of repetitions. We can present things in varied ways. We can paraphrase, we can rewrite, we can redesign, stories, examples. We can provide retrieval practice as repetition. So simulations can be repetition, right? Case studies, role plays, discussions. And we can present things repeated in different media. Okay, so here's some typical uses of repetitions in training. We tell them what we're going to tell them, we tell them, and we tell them what we told them. We present information, have them practice, give them feedback, give them a capstone, present information, tell stories, give examples. So there's lots of ways to do repetitions. What have you seen out there? When do repetitions fail? Yeah.
Well, they don't understand why they're doing what they're doing.
Okay, when the learners don't understand. Okay. Like you're driving them crazy, right?
There's no variety in your repetition.
When there's no variety, right? It's boring, right?
When it leads to negative learning.
Tell me more. Negative learning.
So in other words, if what they're doing is actually causing more harm.
Okay. So if you're repeating things the wrong way.
Right.
Right. You're reinforcing the wrong stuff. Yeah. Right. Okay. So this is fairly straightforward. You don't want to repeat exactly. You don't want to repeat immediately. Not enough variety. One of the interesting things from the learning research is that our learners are overly optimistic about their ability to remember. And what is that? That means that they're going to be thinking, I've got it. It's top of mind. I know this. But then they're not going to give themselves enough practice, enough studying, etc. So we have to do things. We have to be creative in grabbing their attention. Of the simulations you've seen, how well do they utilize repetitions? What could they do better? Think about those of you who are designing simulations. Look deep in your heart and think about your simulation. Yeah.
A few of the simulations I've worked on, there's actually too much repetition.
Okay.
There's the same thing over and over and over.
Now the same design or the same content?
Same kind of activity.
Okay.
Same kind of interfacing with what's going on in the simulation. Whether it be, like a kind of customer scenario.
Okay.
Those kinds of repetitions that go on 10, 12, 20, 25 times.
Right.
At the 10 mark, man, I'm phased out. I'm shut down.
One of the things, you can have the best learning method ever, but if you overuse it, it's not going to work. It's the same thing as simulation. If you have the same background context in your simulation and you use it over and over, and the same kind of interaction and use it over and over, that's not a good thing. So that's a great point. Yeah.
I think for me, it's what the gentleman brought up earlier was, it was just going after you getting that test grade. And it didn't, so it was boring. They weren't really, it was about the repetition, not the learning.
Okay, so we focus on the assessment side, not on the learning side. Yeah. Yeah.
I like the idea that what Michael said, just that if you say, oh, here's a nice simulation of how to do this task or so, but there's 100 tasks. Instead of taking the 20 that they would really like to do and show them the 20, but you make all 100 and make them go through all 100.
Yeah, this is one of the things that we do in the training and development field that we all do. We all want to teach too much content. So we have 100 things we want to teach. We should probably be teaching 40 of those things and focusing on them, putting the rest in reference materials, etc. Or maybe we can provide extra opportunities to look at it later. But it's our subject matter experts tell us you've got to teach all this. It's really important. That's baloney. Great. Yes.
Well, I'm working on a simulation for negotiation for college students negotiating job salaries, compensations. One of the things that sometimes you see with simulation is that they keep using the same scenario and it doesn't avoid file transfer of certain principles.
Right, so that's another problem with repetition. We use the same background context and then it doesn't promote far transfer. That's great. Okay, good. Do you know why these eyes are so weird? Because they're actually one eye. Yeah. So now we'll talk about delayed feedback. When's the best time to give feedback? Well, there's a complicated answer to this. But it's not, those of you who believe that immediate feedback is always better, you're wrong. Okay. But there's a complicated answer. Here's some research. This is no test. This is a test but no feedback, so this is the retrieval practice effect here. This is immediate feedback, and this is after test feedback. So here, delayed feedback was better. Now here's the opposite. No feedback, immediate feedback, feedback after 1 day. Now these folks are publishing in a second-tier journal, and they have some incentives because they're selling a product that gives immediate feedback. So, but I don't completely dismiss this finding because there's a lot of complication in the feedback research. I'm going to give you a link to a feedback review of the research that I did. But here's the general finding: feedback immediately delayed tends to be better than immediate. Now the caveat is that you don't want people going down the wrong retrieval route without giving them feedback first. And maybe over time, if you delay it too long, the feedback, it's not valuable. Like in your situation, driving you nuts. Okay. But you give different feedback for hard versus easy materials? How do you think about when to give more feedback, when to give less, or different ways of giving feedback? Okay, so here's my report, and here's the answer to that question. I can see your brains are full. So early in learning, and when we have complex material, you might need to give more feedback. More elaborate feedback, more emotional support if we can do that, because people are like very nervous about all this complexity. And it's more important to give feedback on correct answers here. If there's a lot of difficulty, people are guessing, so we need to give more feedback on correct answers. When it's later in learning or the material is simple, less feedback's needed, less elaborate feedback, less emotional support, and less important to give feedback on correct answers. And again, you can go back and look at these from the slides that are available.
Before we do that,
yeah.
What is it about the delay that makes it effective?
Okay. All right, actually, we're going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah. We've had such good discussions here that I'm going to plow through some of this. So Sally's an instructor for a 5-day course that covers 12 topics. A new group of recruits will be going through her course in May. So she's given a course in May. Her boss visits her one day and tells her that the first 3 topics are most important and that her learners damn well remember them when they are expected to begin their field work in July. The course is in May, they have to remember it in July. What's Sally do? Should she give them wider spacing, narrow spacing, or it doesn't matter? So the wider spacing would be to teach the first 3 topics every day, teaching those concepts. So that's 5 days, or 5-day course. Narrow spacing would teach the first 3 topics intensively on Monday and Tuesday, repeating those concepts. The learning time's the same. So you might think, hey, it doesn't matter when the concepts are repeated as long as they are repeated with equal time and an equal number of repetitions. Okay, how many people say wider spacing? How many narrower spacing? Okay, and it doesn't matter. How many people are refusing to answer my questions anyway? All right. So wider spacing tends to be better. All right, here's a quote from the Journal of Memory and Language. The spacing effect is one of the oldest and best documented phenomena in the history of learning and memory research. In 1992, somebody counted up the number of studies, and at that time there were over 300, but people study this extensively every year. And here's the typical finding. Non-spaced versus spaced. Non-spaced versus spaced. So spacing things out over time is a real benefit. You can think about it this way. People learn and then they forget. They learn and forget. They learn and forget. And we want to get them over the retrieval threshold. Right? So they're going to retrieve here, they don't retrieve here. So one of the things we can think about doing with our simulations is to create little mini simulations and deliver them spaced over time. A company named SAI Global does this with compliance training, and they create these things called ethical moments because they teach ethical stuff. Not that you're not teaching ethical stuff. So they deliver them like 4 minutes long, deliver them once a month or every 2 weeks, depending on what the client wants, and it refreshes people so they don't forget what they learned. These are whales. And whales sing songs. Probably knew that. But one thing you might not know is that the songs of the whales, they vary over time. In fact, one of the things the whales do is they communicate with these songs, but one of the things, the males sing songs to attract the females. And the females are attracted to those males who change the songs up a bit, that don't use the same song from the previous year, that modify it a little bit. And you know, if you think about it, this happens in our world too, right? Rock and roll evolves. Think about, anybody remember the Beatles? They kept evolving, right? And we like that. The same things happens in classical music. So there's something about variety that we like. So if you have an experiment here where you have people learn in either one room or 2 rooms or 4 rooms, which one's better? Yeah, C's better because it's varied learning, varied context. Okay, here's the experiment for that. If you change, okay, here's an experiment. They had people read some writing, and they either repeated it directly or they just changed the wording a bit. So you can read here, they turned up the street where they had a clear view of the lake. The lake became clearly visible to them as they turned up the street. Well, we know that since I'm talking about variety, there's benefits to that. They remembered 18%. What do you think these folks remembered? More. 41%. Just by changing the words just a little bit. Variety is a key. Now, we don't want to just vary things willy-nilly. And here's some recommendations. These are repetitions of things we already talked about, except for the number 5. Avoid rigid instructional design models that don't allow a flexible approach. So now, to summarize everything, and I know I've given you a lot, and I filled your brain up and like that. You know that when people are learning, that it actually requires, takes glucose out of their blood, and that it's the glucose that allows you to pay attention. In fact, if you have somebody do a difficult task, mental task, they have less power to even grip something later. Their physical ability lowers as well. So it's important. That's why candy in the afternoon during training sessions. Okay. So, when does simulation support retrieval? Context alignment, we've talked about this. Retrieval practice, spacing effect, appropriate variable context. When does simulations hurt retrieval? When we provide them with the wrong context. When retrieval with trivial information. We give them trivial information to retrieve. It's like asking them, we want them to go north or south to north through the forest of their minds. We give them trivial information to retrieve. We're asking them to go east to west. It sets down the wrong markers. We don't want to do that. And we talked about when we provide no retrieval after feedback, that's an issue. When do simulations support understanding? When they prompt learners to pay attention. So sometimes the fact that simulations are engaging enables that focus and enables them to grip the right mental models. We can use simulations to provide an overview of the big picture. When repetitions are needed to fully grok, now I couldn't fit understand in there, so I went back to my science fiction days. Grok means to understand deeply. Any Heinlein fans? When feedback corrects misconceptions, right? And when contingencies are simulated. A lot of times, like when we used to teach management training, we would teach a concept like bring your direct reports into decision making to help them have buy-in, right? That's a principle, that's a concept, but there are some times when you don't want to do that. So simulations are great at specifying the boundary conditions. When do simulations hurt understanding? When there's too many incomprehensible stimuli, when there's inappropriate context used, when too widely spaced early in learning, when only simple situations are completed. There's a lot of stuff up there. I'll let you look at that later and we can talk about that during cocktail hour. But you can see we want to use simulations wisely, not willy-nilly. I'm just going to go through this quickly. I've been doing this research for 14 years. I decided that there's 12 major things that we need to do. Okay, some baseline stuff, engagement, understanding, remembering. These are the 3 things that support long-term remembering: retrieval practice, context alignment, and spacing. But here's what simulation has done for us. It provides repetition, feedback, retrieval practice, context alignment, spacing, and if we do it right, it can provide variation as well. So to reinforce Ken's point that simulations are variable, here are the learning factors that really matter. Remember I said it's not simulations that correct learning, that create learning. It's these things and a few others that create the learning. Okay, so we've come to the end. There's research to suggest if you set a trigger so that if you find yourself in a certain situation, you're more likely to use what you learn. You might want to do this after this session. So to utilize these learning research fundamentals in my work as a simulation designer, when I design my next simulation, I will take some actions. Or if you're a purchaser, when I review the next simulation, I will take some actions. This has been found to actually help people do things at like twice the rate that they're normally doing. I'm going to talk about that in my later